The house was built in 1887. I know because the date is carved into the stone lintel above the front door. Small, precise numbers cut by a mason whose name no one remembers anymore. I used to run my fingers over those numbers when I came home from work. 137 years of Georgia summers and Atlantic storms, and the house had never once changed hands outside our family. My husband Edward died on a Thursday in April. By the following Monday, while I was sitting at a funeral home on Bull Street choosing between two shades of mahogany casket, someone was across town signing paperwork that would transfer that house, our house, the house with the carved date and the wrought iron fence and the garden Edward had tended for 40 years, to a real estate development company for $340,000. I did not know this was happening. Edward had dementia. He had been diagnosed 18 months earlier, and by the time he died, he did not know what city he lived in. He did not know the year. On most days, he did not know my name. What I still cannot fully explain, what no one has been able to fully explain to me, is who made the call that brought him to that office. My name is Virginia Holloway. I am 80 years old and I live in Savannah, Georgia. I spent 31 years working in public education, 22 of them as a classroom teacher, and the last 9 as principal of an elementary school on the east side of the city. I retired at 68 in good health, with a marriage of 53 years and a house that had been in Edward's family since his great-grandfather built it the year Grover Cleveland was first elected president. I am still in that house. I want you to know that before I tell you the rest, because the story I am about to share has an ending, and the ending matters. But the path to that ending was the hardest 18 months of my life, harder, in some ways, than losing Edward himself, because losing Edward was grief, and what came after was something else entirely. If you are watching for the first time, please subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you are from. There is something I find genuinely comforting about knowing where people are listening from. We are more connected than we realize. Now let me tell you how this started. Edward Holloway was the kind of man who fixed things. Not in a sentimental way, I mean literally. He was a civil engineer by training and by temperament, and he approached every problem in our life the way he would have approached a structural calculation, methodically, patiently, with complete confidence that there was a correct answer if you were willing to work for it. When the roof needed repairs, he climbed up and assessed it himself before calling anyone. When the garden wall began to lean, he researched the soil composition and rebuilt the foundation by hand over 3 weekends. When our children had problems, he sat with them until he understood the problem completely before offering a single word of advice. We had 3 children, Robert, James, and our daughter, Patricia. Robert moved to Atlanta after college and built a career in banking. James settled in Charleston, where he teaches at the college. Patricia lives here in Savannah, 20 minutes from our house, which meant she was present for most of what I am about to tell you, in ways that I am still sorting through. The house had been in Edward's family since 1887. His great-grandfather, a carpenter named Thomas Holloway, built it on a lot he purchased with 12 years of savings. Thomas's son lived in it. His son after that. Edward's father inherited it in 1961, and Edward inherited it when his father died in 1989. We had lived in it together since 1971 when we married. We had raised our children in it. We had buried 3 dogs in the back garden and grown tomatoes every summer for 50 years and repainted the exterior exactly 4 times. The house was listed on the Savannah Register of Historic Places. It was not the grandest house on the street. Savannah has grander, but it was real, and it was ours, and the thought of it belonging to anyone else had genuinely never occurred to me. Edward's diagnosis came in October of 2022. He was 79 years old. We had noticed things for about a year before that, small things, the kind you explain away because you are not ready to stop explaining them away. He forgot appointments. He repeated questions. He lost words in the middle of sentences and looked at me with an expression I had not seen before, a kind of searching bewilderment, as if the word had been there a moment ago and he couldn't understand where it had gone. The neurologist was kind and direct. She said it was Alzheimer's, that it was moderately advanced, and that we needed to prepare for a progressive decline over the next 1 to 3 years. She asked if we had our legal affairs in order, wills, power of attorney, healthcare directives. I said we did. She said to review them. We had wills prepared in 2015. They were straightforward, everything to each other, and in the event of both of our deaths, divided equally among our 3 children. We had not updated them since then, and we had not established a power of attorney because we had not needed one and because Edward, even in the months after his diagnosis, was still present enough that the conversation felt premature. I waited too long to have that conversation. This is one of the things I will tell you plainly, without softening it. I waited too long, and that delay was part of what made everything that followed possible. By the spring of 2023, Edward no longer knew the names of our grandchildren. By that fall, he sometimes did not recognize our house when we pulled into the driveway, would look at the front door with genuine uncertainty, as if trying to place it. By the winter, he had stopped being able to follow the thread of a conversation for more than a few minutes. By February of 2024, he was largely confined to the first floor and required assistance with most daily tasks. He died on April 4, 2024. Peacefully, in the bedroom we had shared for 53 years, with me holding his hand and Patricia sitting in the chair by the window. He was the best man I have ever known. I want to say that clearly, here, because what I am about to tell you happened around him without his knowledge or consent, and I do not want the story of his final months to become only a story about what was done to him. He was a good man. He deserved better. The first sign came in January of 2024, 3 months before Edward died. I had been managing our finances alone for most of the previous year. Edward had handed the checkbook to me without protest, which was itself a sign of how far he had declined, because in 50 years of marriage, he had never willingly surrendered the checkbook. I was reviewing our accounts online one evening when I noticed a withdrawal I didn't recognize. $1,400 to a company called Coastal Heritage Consultants, LLC. I didn't know that name. I searched for it and found a minimal web presence, a one-page site with a Savannah address and a phone number and a vague description of services relating to historic property assessment and estate planning consultation. I called the number the following morning. A man answered, polite and professional, and said that Edward had contacted them some months prior regarding an assessment of the property. He said he had met with Edward twice at the house. I said that Edward had Alzheimer's disease and was not capable of initiating business arrangements. There was a pause. The man said he hadn't been aware of that. He said he would look into his records and call me back. He did not call me back. I called again 3 days later. The number rang without answer. I called a 4th time the following week. Same result. I wrote down the company name and the address and the phone number, and I put the paper in my desk drawer, because Edward was declining rapidly by then, and I did not have the capacity to pursue anything that wasn't directly related to his care. This is the second thing I will tell you plainly. I did not pursue it. I was exhausted. I was watching my husband disappear. I put the paper in the drawer, and I told myself I would deal with it later. Later came sooner than I expected, and not in the way I anticipated. The second sign came in March, 6 weeks before Edward died. Patricia stopped by on a Tuesday afternoon. She did this several times a week and mentioned, somewhat offhandedly, that she had run into a man named Garrett Pruitt at the pharmacy. Garrett Pruitt was a local real estate developer, moderately well known in Savannah for buying historic properties, renovating them partially, and converting them to short-term rentals or boutique commercial spaces. I knew who he was by reputation but had never met him. Patricia said Pruitt had asked after Edward, expressed his condolences about Edward's health, and said he hoped the family was doing well. She said he had been friendly and seemed genuinely sympathetic. She mentioned this the way you mention a small, unremarkable social interaction. She did not mention it again. I thought about it afterward, though. I thought about it because it struck me as slightly odd, not alarming, just slightly odd, that a real estate developer would be personally aware of Edward's health condition. We had not advertised it. Our friends knew and our family knew, and of course the medical team knew, but it was not the kind of information that circulated widely. I noted it and did nothing with it because I was, by March, doing very little beyond caring for Edward and sleeping when I could. Edward died 6 weeks later. The third sign, the one that was not a sign but a collision, came 8 days after the funeral. I was at home on a Wednesday morning when a man knocked on my front door. He was perhaps 45 years old, in a jacket and tie, carrying a leather folio. He introduced himself as a representative of a company called Low Country Restoration Group and said he was following up regarding the property. I said I didn't know what he meant. He said his company had recently completed a purchase of the property and was following up to arrange a timeline for the transfer of occupancy. I stood at my front door for a moment that felt much longer than it was. I said, "I'm sorry. What purchase?" He opened his folio and produced a document. It was a deed of sale. The property at our address, described in full legal language. The seller's name was Edward James Holloway. The buyer was Low Country Restoration Group, LLC. The sale price was $340,000. The date of the transaction was April 7, 2024. April 7th was a Sunday. It was 4 days after Edward died. I looked at the signature on the seller's line. It was Edward's name. The handwriting did not look like Edward's handwriting, but I had not seen Edward's handwriting in over a year, and I understood that dementia affects motor function as well as memory, and I could not say with certainty that it was not his hand. I said, very carefully, "My husband died on April 4th. The man looked at the document. He looked at me. He said he was very sorry, but that the paperwork had been filed and recorded before he was aware of any such circumstance. I said, "My husband had Alzheimer's disease. He was not capable of executing a legal transaction." The man said he would need to speak with his company's legal counsel and would be in touch. He left. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway of a house that someone was telling me I no longer owned, and I thought about the paper in my desk drawer with the name Coastal Heritage Consultants, LLC, and I thought about Garrett Pruitt at the pharmacy asking after Edward's health. And I understood, in the way that you understand something when the pieces finally assemble themselves, what had happened. I called my attorney that same afternoon. His name was Franklin Oakes. He had handled Edward's father's estate decades ago and had been our family's attorney ever since. He was 72 years old and semi-retired, but when I explained what had happened, his voice sharpened in a way I recognized as professional attention. I told him about the deed. I told him about Coastal Heritage Consultants. I told him about Garrett Pruitt. I told him about the April 7th date. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Virginia, April 7th was a Sunday." I said I knew. He said, "Property deeds can be backdated. A transaction can be documented as occurring on one date and filed on another. The question is where Edward actually signed, if he signed, and under what circumstances." I asked him what we needed to do. He said we needed to file an emergency motion to void the deed on the grounds of mental incapacity and potential fraud. He said we needed to do it quickly, before Low Country Restoration Group took any further steps toward occupancy or resale. He said we also needed to contact the Chatham County Recorder's Office and place a notation on the title pending legal proceedings. He filed the motion the following morning. What emerged over the next 3 months, through court discovery and investigation, was a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than I had anticipated. Coastal Heritage Consultants, LLC had been formed 11 months earlier, in May of 2023, 5 months after Edward's diagnosis, by a man named Dennis Hale. Hale had a background in real estate transactions and a prior connection to Garrett Pruitt's development company going back several years. The two were not formally affiliated, but they had worked together on at least 3 previous transactions involving historic Savannah properties. Phone records subpoenaed during the proceedings showed 14 calls between Hale's number and a number registered to Pruitt's company in the 12 months before Edward died. The records also showed 3 calls to our home landline during that same period, calls I had not answered and had not thought to question at the time. The $1,400 withdrawal I had found in January was payment for what Hale's records described as an in-home property consultation, a meeting at which Hale had spent approximately 90 minutes with Edward alone, while I was at a medical appointment. My neighbor, who had seen an unfamiliar car in the driveway that day, confirmed this when asked. The deed itself, The one dated April 7th bore Edward's signature above a notarization stamp from a notary public named Cecilia Wren, whose commission was registered in Chatham County. Franklin subpoenaed Wren's notary journal. The journal showed the notarization had occurred not on April 7th, but on March 28th, 1 week before Edward died, when he was largely bedridden and, according to his hospice nurse's records from that same date, had scored a 3 out of 30 on the standard cognitive assessment administered during her morning visit. A 3 out of 30. The hospice nurse, whose records were meticulous, testified in deposition that on March 28th Edward had not been able to identify the season, the year, the name of the current president, or his own address. He had identified me correctly when shown a photograph. He had not been able to complete a simple 3-step instruction. Franklin asked the judge to consider what it would mean for a man in that condition to have executed a legally binding real estate transaction on that same day. The judge did not need much time to consider it. I was in the courtroom the day the ruling came down. It was a Tuesday in August, 4 months after Edward died. The judge voided the deed in its entirety, citing lack of contractual capacity on the part of the seller and evidence of predatory targeting of a vulnerable adult. He referred the matter to the Chatham County District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. Low Country Restoration Group's attorneys stood up and began to say something about good faith purchase and filed documentation. The judge looked at him over his reading glasses and said, "Your client purchased a historic property from a man who, on the date of the alleged transaction, could not name the season of the year. I am not interested in arguments about good faith." The room was very quiet. The criminal investigation took 8 months. In April of 2025, almost exactly 1 year after Edward died, Dennis Hale was indicted on 2 counts of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and 1 count of forgery in the 2nd degree. The forgery charge related to the April 7th date on the deed. Investigators determined that Hale had altered the transaction date after the fact to create distance from Edward's death and complicate any challenge to the document's validity. Garrett Pruitt was not indicted. His attorney successfully argued that there was insufficient direct evidence connecting Pruitt to the specific transaction, and the phone records, while suggestive, were not sufficient on their own to establish criminal participation. He denied any knowledge of Hale's methods and expressed what his attorney described as genuine distress at learning the circumstances of the transaction. "I do not know what Garrett Pruitt knew or didn't know. I know what the phone records show." The jury in Hale's case, which was held in November of 2025, heard those records as well. Hale was convicted on both exploitation counts and the forgery charge. He was sentenced to 6 years, with parole eligibility after 3. Cecilia Wren, the notary, surrendered her commission and entered into a deferred prosecution agreement in exchange for her cooperation with investigators. She told prosecutors that Hale had brought Edward to her office, had driven him there, and had represented the transaction as routine estate planning. She said Edward had been quiet and cooperative and had signed where indicated without appearing to understand the document. She said she had noted that he seemed confused, but had not inquired further because she was told he was simply elderly and tired. She said she had not known he had dementia. I have sat with that statement for a long time. I do not know whether to believe it. I know that a notary has a professional obligation to ensure that the person signing a document understands what they are signing, and that quiet and cooperative is not the same as competent. I know that she made a choice, whether from negligence or from something worse, and that choice had consequences. I know that she has to live with it. So do I. The deed to our home was restored to Edward's estate in September of 2024 and subsequently transferred to me as the sole heir, as specified in his will. The house on Bull Street, the one with the carved date above the door, the wrought iron fence, the garden I have been tending alone since April, is mine again, as it should always have been. 3 months after the criminal proceedings concluded, I established the Holloway Fund for Elder Protection, a small nonprofit organization partnering with Savannah Area Legal Aid Services to provide free consultations for families navigating estate planning and elder financial protection. In the first year, we served 47 families. Franklin Oakes chairs the advisory board. He does it without charging a fee. The question I am asked most often by my children, by people who have heard the story, by the journalists who have written about the case, is whether I know who made the first call, who identified our house as a target, who first called Hale and pointed him toward a historic property with an ailing owner and a wife who was too exhausted to notice the warning signs in time. The honest answer is that I don't know with certainty. The phone records suggest a direction. The timing of Coastal Heritage Consultants' formation 5 months after Edward's diagnosis became known suggests that someone with knowledge of his condition was involved in initiating the scheme. The pharmacist who was present when Patricia encountered Pruitt told investigators that Pruitt had asked specifically about whether Edward was still living at the house. But I do not have a name. The investigation closed without answering that question fully. And I have had to make a decision about how much of my remaining time I am willing to spend trying to answer it. I have decided not to spend very much more. I am 80 years old. I do not have the luxury of infinite time, and I have learned slowly, and at some cost, that there is a difference between justice and resolution. Justice, in this case, came. Hale is in prison. The house is mine. The Holloway Fund is doing work that Edward would have approved of. That is justice. Resolution, the complete understanding of every thread, every decision, every phone call that led to a man being driven to a notary's office while his wife sat at a funeral home choosing a casket that may not come. And I have decided I can live without it. What I want to leave you with is practical, because I am a practical person by nature and by training, and the 31 years I spent in public education taught me that people remember what is useful. If your spouse, your parent, your family member receives an Alzheimer's or dementia diagnosis, do 3 things immediately. Not eventually, immediately. First, establish power of attorney. This is the legal document that authorizes you to make decisions on behalf of the person with the diagnosis. You must do this while they are still legally competent to grant it. Once cognitive decline passes a certain threshold, it is too late and the window closes faster than you expect. Edward and I did not have a power of attorney. That absence was part of what made this possible. Second, place a notation on your property title at the county recorder's office indicating that any transfer of the property requires your co-signature. This is a simple administrative step that costs very little. In some jurisdictions, it is called a deed restriction or a title alert. Franklin told me afterward that this single step would have blocked Hale's transaction entirely. I did not know it existed. Third, if anyone contacts you or your family member about the property, anyone, regardless of how they present themselves, document it immediately. The name, the company, the date, what was said. Call your attorney the same day. The $1,400 withdrawal I found in January was a warning. I saw it and I filed it away because I was too tired to act on it. I will spend a long time wishing I had acted on it. The house is quiet in the evenings now. I sit on the back porch when the weather allows, and I look at Edward's garden, and I talk to him the way you talk to people who can no longer answer. I tell him about the grandchildren. I tell him about the fund. I tell him the house is still here, exactly where he left it, with the carved date above the door and the tomatoes coming in late this year the way they always do. I think he would be glad to know it. Tell me where you are watching from today. And if you know someone who is caring for a spouse or parent with dementia, please share this story. The steps I described take less than an afternoon to put in place. They took me 18 months to recover from not having done them. Thank you for being here with me today.